Hello, everyone. If you're here, welcome. My name is Gaby, and today I thought I would actually get on and talk about some of the basics around grief and the impact it has on us in the many different aspects of our life, and then also talk about the brain in particular, because I think it's really important to understand a little bit about why we're experiencing all these different symptoms and why it might be so hard to just function day to day. So if you have any questions or any comments along the way, please let me know and I should be able to respond as I go. So I might actually share the screen and then you can get started. So I'm going to start with just basically, what is grief? Because I guess we just talk about it a lot of times, like everyone's on the same page and everyone kind of understands it in the same way. But it's really not the case. There are so many different definitions for grief and so many different ways that people understand grief. You might have a different way of looking at it than I do or than other people in the community do. So it's good to sort of just define it to begin with and then go from there. So grief is actually just a natural response to loss. And, you know, another thing is loss. Like loss can be so many different things. It doesn't have to be death related. It could be based on a loss of ability or a relationship breakdown or a loss of freedom or the loss of a job and loss of employment, financial loss. It could be um, you know losing contact with someone, losing a connection with someone that you had a connection with. So there's so many different, I guess, ways that you can experience loss, and grief is often thought of as the emotional response, but grief can actually include so many different facets of our life, and I'm going to go through them in a minute. But to begin with, it's just a natural response to loss that everybody will experience grief at some point, or everyone, or you probably are already experiencing it now. So it's just something that is an inevitable part of life. So grief impacts, as I said, like all aspects of our life. Grief has an emotional element to it. So that could be sadness, that could be anger, that could be confusion. It's not just sadness. Grief can encompass so many different emotions and waves of emotions. We can go from feeling sad to having to feeling happy when we remember or when we see a photo of someone that we love, but then that can make us sad again. And we can, in grief as well, it's so complex that we can experience more than one emotion at the same time. So that term of bittersweet comes to mind, because in grief, even when you might be celebrating something like a birthday, or when you might have reached a particular milestone, like you're graduating from something, or you've achieved something that you've been working towards. After loss, there's usually that bittersweet feeling, because that person that you really love is not there, and they probably would have been there if they were still here, if they were still alive. So it's very the emotional response to loss is really complex. The other thing is the physical body. When we hold all those emotions in our body due to grief, that can come out in physical ways. People have said they might have felt like a tight chest. Their heart, literally might be hurting. You might experience like back pain, or you might experience nausea, or it just, it could be anything. But there's soreness in the body, tension. You might be holding on to a lot of the stress from the loss and from the grief, and that can come out in all sorts of ways. So grief is very physical as well as emotional. And cognition, this is something I will expand on in a little bit, but that's the mental impact of grief. And when we grieve, it's not just emotions. It's not just, it doesn't just physically show in the body, but also in our mental functioning. We can really struggle in lots of ways to do tasks that require that mental effort and that require that, especially executive functioning of our brain, the things that, where we need to make decisions, or those tasks that require a little bit more thinking might become really hard. So we might have difficulty concentrating, and it could also affect our memory. We might have short-term memory loss. And I'll expand on this a little bit later, but definitely grief it really takes a toll on our mental capacity. And the other thing is behavior. So grief, it naturally changes the way we behave, because when you think about it, our thoughts and our emotions also impact what we do and how we move around in the world. And so our behavior, we might want to be more withdrawn, and that, ties into relationships as well, but we might want to spend more time alone, or we might not go out to events that we might normally go out to. We might end up actually eating less or more. It can affect our appetite. And you might notice subtle ways that your behavior has changed after loss. Relationships. This is a big one. I think we don't realize, until it happens, how much grief can impact our relationships, because it's only after a loss that we realize that a lot of people, we are really not equipped to deal with someone who's grieving, and to know, a lot of people don't know how to support you as you grieve. And so you might experience a loss of connection and a loss of friendships, and there might be more, I guess, tensions within your family, or there might be just different things that come up that cause relationships to sort of break down, or be a little bit more tense. And that can happen even between spouses as well. If you've lost a family member and your spouse is not quite there for you, or isn't quite sure how to support you, it might, cause a bit of stress within the relationship and strain. And so that's completely normal in grief. And I know that when I lost my mom when I was 20, at the time, I didn't know anybody else my age who would be able to understand what I was going through or relate. And so my friends just didn't, most of them just didn't know really what to do. And so some, as that some might say nothing and distance themselves because it's too uncomfortable. And so relationships can really become strained after loss. And that's unfortunately, I guess, part of what can happen. If you do have one or two connections in your life that, are really there, then you're probably, you're really lucky that you even have that in your life, because Some people realize that they don't have anybody, and that can really add to the grief. That can become its own grief as well, that loss of connection and loss of friendship or relationship. The next one is sense of self and identity. So when we experience a loss, especially if it's the loss of somebody or a relationship that is really significant in our lives, we can often become, I guess, unsure of what our identity is, and that part of ourselves as in relation to that person is kind of lost in a way. And especially before we find different ways of continuing that connection, it can be really disorienting. Like in my case, I was a daughter, and I'm still a daughter because I've still got my dad, but my connection with my mum was the strongest that I had in my life. And so my role as a daughter, it sort of shifted a lot. And because in the lead up to um, my mum passing, I had a lot of extra responsibilities while she was unwell. And so that complete kind of emptiness after it all ended was quite it had quite an effect on me and my identity and my sense of self, because I'd sort of revolved and that can happen with carers. Like if you're caring for someone in the lead up to their death, your life kind of revolves around them and revolves around what you need to do to help them, or what you need to do to keep them going and to keep them as well as they can be. And so once that responsibility and that kind of purpose is gone, you can feel pretty lost. And I know I felt that as well when mum died. So the sense of self and identity, yeah, that can really take a toll as well. The last one is I wanted to add was spirituality, and I think that's not not commonly spoken about, because I guess it's hard to really quantify. So with spirituality, that can also relate to any religious practice or beliefs that you might have. And when we experience a loss, I think that really brings into question all that we know and all of our beliefs. And it's natural to kind of start questioning things. Some people end up it might end up strengthening their faith and strengthening the beliefs that they had prior to the loss. But then for others, it might actually shift the beliefs a little bit, or it might completely dismantle them. And you might end up, if you are someone who had a strong faith, that could be really rattled after a loss, and you might, there might be a sense of injustice, or there might be kind of too many questions that are unanswered. And so that can also mean that you lose your faith, or that's also sometimes what happens. And so the spiritual aspect of it, there's actually a new theory that came out that really centers the existential questions that we ask ourselves after loss. And I think I found that to be also really a significant part of the change in my life, because I started to base my beliefs around my experiences. And so that kind of shifted, because a lot of the beliefs I might have grown up with and that I might have been taught didn't really, I couldn't fully trust in them anymore, or I couldn't sort of support them with my experiences. So that created a shift as well. Yeah. So emotions, so there's a lot there. But yes, emotions, grief impacts emotions, your physical body, cognition, behavior, relationships, your sense of self and identity, and then also your spirituality. And yes, your response to loss can vary a lot depending on quite a few things, but some of those things are culture, what your cultural background is, or even actually the culture that you grew up with, which might be different to your family culture, your ethnicity. Could also vary depending on your, yes, society, which also ties into culture. It can depend on the relationship that you have, that you had to the person, or the relationship, the thing that you've lost. It can depend on the death and how it happened, how the loss happened, because there are a lot of maybe things that are stigmatized in society, and that can affect the response that you get to your grief, and then that can affect your grief itself, the grief itself. And then lastly, family dynamics and systems. And I think there are others as well, but these are some of the ones I wanted to highlight. So, impact of grief on the brain. This is, I think, something that you just when you experience it, you have no idea what's going on, and it's only years later than I that I actually did the research and realized, okay, so this is actually makes sense once you know kind of what's happening in the brain. So our brain actually interprets grief as a kind of trauma, and it kind of goes into survival mode, and it tries to, I guess, keep us alive, and that becomes its main function. It wants to just there's a threat. It sees it as a threat, and the grief as a threat, and so it wants to sort of keep us just keep us going, and so the primitive aspects of our brain are the ones that really become activated, and that can also causes the fight, flight, or freeze response to be activated during that time. And it's especially true, I think, when you're going through acute trauma or grief, sorry, when you're going through the acute stages or periods of grief, that could be like soon after the loss, and that can be when anniversaries come up or when birthdays come up, and you experience that acuteness of grief as well again. So this is the parts of your brain that can become activated. It's the limbic system, which I believe is the oldest part of our brain. So there's the hippocampus, amygdala, which is the emotional center. There's the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the cingulate gyrus. And so those specifically, those particularly get activated when we are grieving and when we're in that survival mode. And some of the things, yeah. So grief brain is a real thing that can come out in so many different ways, and I just wanted to highlight some of those here. So there's other symptoms as well, but things like forgetfulness, as I mentioned, that impact on our memory. We might have a slower processing speed than usual. We might lose things more often. So I think I have heard people just talk about doing really unusual things, like you might put your keys in the fridge, or you might, I don't know, like put your bag in the microwave, or you might kind of just do things that feel very disconnected and very disjointed, because you're not actually in your executive functioning mode. When you're in survival mode, you're thinking through things can be really hard. And so feeling overwhelmed is a symptom of grief. And because when you're trying to make decisions and you're trying to continue, I guess, your normal functioning, but your brain is in survival mode, anything other than what it needs to keep you alive it gets too much, and that can become overwhelming, and we're just overloaded with information and those tasks that we might think are quite simple when we're not grieving, but when we do experience a loss, those everyday tasks and decisions that we need to make can really become too much. So feeling overwhelmed, disrupted sleep, you might not be able to sleep very well, or maybe some people might actually sleep too much. There's difficulty concentrating, foggy brain, confusion, and yeah, making decisions becomes a lot harder. So these are there is more, and you might have some that you've experienced that are not on here as well. So do let me know if there are things that you would add. But yeah, I hope you found this helpful. I just wanted to, I guess, highlight some of the foundations of what happens within our brain and within us when we experience loss and when we're grieving, because we often experience those things, but we just don't know why, and we don't know whether it's normal. We don't know what's happening internally and physically and physiologically. And so this is the reason what I explained is the reason why we go through these things, because physiologically we go into, and brain wise we go into survival mode. And so at that point, all your body wants to do is just be fed, be hydrated, and just to keep breathing. And so everything else, like tasks at work or in anything else that, decisions that we need to make, like what to eat, and everything else becomes just extra. And so it's not really where our state of mind is at. We're not really equipped for executive functioning. And I think that's why sometimes it is hard after a loss or soon after, when you're faced with the decisions around, how someone will be farewelled, what kind of, how they will be, whether they're cremated or buried, or what kind of coffin, or if all those things that you might need to think about when a person has just recently died, is you're really not in the state of mind to make the best decisions. And so sometimes, yeah, looking back, you might think, oh yeah, that wasn't the best decision, but really you were in survival mode. And so you did your best at that time, and you really physiologically couldn't do much more. And you weren't, when we're in acute grief, making thoughtful, rational decisions is not our strength, because we're only using usually the primitive aspects of our brain are the most activated, and the executive functioning of our brain kind of diminishes for that time. And so, be kind to yourself in terms of looking back and thinking about what you might have said to someone, or what decisions you might have made, because grief really does take a toll on our body and on our minds. And it takes a lot of time to actually process it and start to get closer to our normal functioning. And so, we are never the same after a loss. There is an article that talks about how grief rewires the brain, and that can't really be, that can't fully go back to normal. We can't ever fully go back to normal, to how we were before the loss. So I guess it's just part of the human experience, that once we experience a significant loss, we're going to be different. We're going to feel different. And that's okay. That's normal. That's just part of the journey. So I really hope that, yeah, this has been helpful. Let me know if there's any questions. But other than that, I will keep this up as a recording, and if I'll put a link also to a form where you can suggest topics for future weeks. I'm going to try and do this every week on a Thursday, on the morning. For me it's the morning, but for you it might be an evening. But yes, I will take your suggestions if you have any particular topics around grief that you'd like me to cover, or just in general in terms of life after loss. Please let me know, and I'll put together something each week, and I'll, even if it's just a discussion, and you can ask questions, and yeah, I'll answer them. Yeah, so I hope that you got something out of this, and I will see you on the app.